You know, for the last 2 years, we've pretty much heard every single pro Israel political pundit, media personality, TikToker consistently either downplay the Gaza Ministry of Health's death toll number or overtly accuse the Gaza Ministry of Health of lying about the death toll because it's Hamas run. Run back the tape.
I said we should be skeptical of the Gaza death toll. Everybody freaked out. It's literally reported by Hamas. A professor of statistics and data science at the University of Penn Wharton provided a detailed analysis of the data from the Gaza Health Ministry, which showed that they had, at the very minimum, doctored and at worst completely faked it.
I told you that the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, is full of shit.
As much as you guys want to deny it, there is very likely some funny business going on there with the numbers.
But today we have a news story out in both Haaretz, which is a left-wing Israeli news source, and Times of Israel, which is a more center-right Israeli news source, that the IDF has officially accepted the Gaza Ministry of Health's death toll numbers. Not just accepted their death toll numbers, but accept the fact that it's likely an undercount considering many people are still buried under the rubble and haven't been accounted for in terms of reported to have died. Excuse me. So Haaretz reads, the IDF accepts the Gaza Health Ministry death toll of over 71,000 Palestinians killed during the war. Although many international experts have accepted the health ministry's data as reliable and even conservative relative to the true death toll, Israel has refused to accept the health ministry's account up until now. This is not just a notable story because we now have confirmation that even Israeli intelligence accepts these numbers, but it is an overt admission that they have functionally lied to the international community, to everyone that they've espoused their propaganda towards, that these death toll numbers were exaggerated or overcounted. So I'm going to read to you the Times of Israel article, which is headlined something similar, but they do make a few framing edits that I'll be sure to note and discuss in this video. So Times of Israel, their headline reads, the IDF believes 70,000 Gazans killed in the war as claimed by Hamas. And then they also put civilian to combatant ratio is unclear. This is something I want to discuss at the end. It's been often said that the issue with the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers is that they don't differentiate between who's Hamas and who's civilian. This is true. However, the IDF doesn't come out with reports on how many civilians they expect to have killed. They only come out with reports of how many Hamas combatants they've reported to have been killed, or they believe to have been killed. And there's a lot to be said about that, considering if Israel was conducting and was conducive to the laws of war and international law, they should have a good idea of how many civilians they've killed. Otherwise, they're just not accounting for civilians when they're going after Hamas. But we know through their conduct, they're not just going after Hamas. They've obstructed aid to the Gaza Strip, hence why we've seen genuine starvation and malnutrition plague people in Gaza. So let's go ahead and read this article, and then I'm going to come back to this idea a little bit later. So, figure. Acknowledged by senior military official doesn't include those under rubble, who Hamas says make up 10,000 more. Israel largely rejected Hamas's toll during the war. So the article reads, the Israeli Defense Forces believe that the Hamas-run health ministry's death toll from the war in Gaza Strip has been largely accurate, a senior Israeli military official acknowledged on Thursday. Briefing reporters on condition of anonymity, the official said that the IDF believes the Gaza death count from the 2+ year war sparked by Hamas's October 7th onslaught is around 70,000. The Gaza Health Ministry's current death toll is 71,667 lives, including over 450 killed since the October 2025 ceasefire. The senior military official said that the actual breakdown of the Gaza death toll is still under review, and it is unknown exactly how many of the dead are members of the terror group and how many of the dead died directly as a result of the fighting. I will say it is actually expected that this death toll does not account for indirect deaths and is a death toll of direct deaths, notably because the death toll does not have excess deaths of particularly newborns, toddlers, etc., and the elderly. So although there has been a high amount of very young children and elderly people who have died and are accounted for in the Gaza death toll, it's not extraordinarily excessive, which is what you would expect if the death toll was accounting for indirect deaths. Israel largely rejected the death toll claimed by Hamas's health ministry during the war, especially following specific incidents in which the terror group announced what Israeli officials called, quote, exaggerated tolls. So understand what this means thus far. This means not dissimilar to what we've seen from the IDF previously, is the IDF has just admitted to overtly lying about accusing the Gaza Ministry of Health and Hamas for exaggerating their death toll numbers, right? They went from overtly denying the death toll numbers and accusing Hamas and the Gaza Ministry of Health and these healthcare workers who are working with little to no infrastructure of exaggerating the numbers or of just manufacturing them and faking them. They went from accusing them of that to just acknowledging that, yeah, it's actually accurate. And this is now, there's a part of the story that really isn't new news. Yuval Abraham, who is an Israeli journalist out of Plus 972, who's done extraordinary work in revealing a lot of internal things regarding the IDF. He made a report over 2 years ago now that that cited Israeli military officials and intelligence that they were regularly using the Gaza Ministry of Health's death toll numbers in intelligence briefings, and that they did find them to be largely accurate. So really, this entire story is just a solidified affirmation of what we already knew, which is that, of course, the IDF doesn't believe this is an exaggerated death toll. What the IDF acknowledges, actually, is that this is an underreported death toll, similar to what many experts on the matter have also concluded, that if you account for things like indirect deaths, if you account for the fact that there have been at least thousands of people who are buried under the rubble who have not even been reported to have died, then this death toll is actually an undercount, and that it's likely much higher, maybe between 80 to 100,000 people plus, right? According to the military official, the toll does not include bodies believed to have been under the rubble in Gaza, which Hamas estimates around 10,000, to be around 10,000. The Gaza Ministry also claims that at least 440 Palestinians have died of malnutrition and starvation in the Strip during the war. Israel denies this, with the military official claiming that these statistics are manipulated by Hamas to include individuals with underlying and severe health issues. This is a ridiculous statement. To suggest that somebody did not die of starvation because they had an underlying health problem is similar to what we saw from MAGA when they were denying the death numbers from COVID. Just because somebody has comorbidities doesn't mean that COVID wasn't the ultimate factor that ultimately killed them. Similarly, malnutrition and starvation can be the ultimate factor that kills you, and it's expected that the first people to die of starvation in a population undergoing starvation are going to be those who have underlying severe health issues. So this is completely, like, it's actually disgusting that they would deny it. They would deny the amount of Palestinians, because this isn't even really a denial, but to say that they're denying it based on the fact that they believe it's manipulated data, it's not manipulated. It's actually what you'd expect. And this is also something that we saw out of the Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication, etc. The Gaza Health Ministry's record include the names of and IDs of over 90% of the bodies found. They do not differentiate between civilians and combatants. Israel never refuted the Hamas Health Ministry's data with its own exact figures, instead periodically offering rough ratios of civilians to combatants. Okay, so I want to get into this whole civilian to combatant ratio perspective, because what you'll often hear, and what we've read into in this article, is that the Gaza Ministry of Health doesn't differentiate between who's Hamas, who's a part of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who is essentially a combatant, right, and who is a civilian. Now, you can actually evaluate the demographic data through which this article makes mention. 90% of the bodies found they have full records of. You can evaluate the demographic data in terms of the age, in terms of the gender of those who have died, to assess a rough estimate of how many combatants who have died, especially when you compare it to other regional conflicts around the world. So there's two things. The first of which is that if you just go based off of children, so, and even if you account it for maybe, let's say, children under the age of 16, because I know a lot of Israeli and IDF propagandists like to say that, well, sometimes there's like 17-year-old Hamas members. That is not a statistically significant portion of the Hamas combatants, and it's absurd to suggest so. But okay, let's say children under 16, and then women and men over the age of 60. All of those populations, roughly 100% of them are going to be civilians, roughly, right? Just taking those numbers alone, you already get about half of the deaths in Gaza. So already, that is already a 1-to-1, and that assumes that every single man between the ages, or rather even teenagers, between the ages of 17 to 59 is a combatant. Obviously, that is not the case, right? Obviously, not only are there thousands of men, civilian men who have died, but it's actually the case that for most armed conflicts, including that of genocides, for example, in the case of Bosnia, in case of Darfur, and what's happening in Malaysia, even in Rwanda, civilian men are killed at least at the same rate as combatant men. So in other words, at least half of just the male combatant age population is civilian, minimum. It's likely much higher, because you have to understand, when it comes to Gaza, right, we're seeing people die. We were seeing people slaughtered, unarmed people, mostly men, slaughtered at these GHF sites, these Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this Israeli US-backed group where private mercenaries were gunning down Palestinians attempting to get food, using it as a so-called policing tactic. It is mostly civilian men who are going out to and putting themselves at risk to find food, shelter, and resources for their family. So just based on that alone, you already get about 75 to 80% of just the recorded death toll of being civilians, which already puts the ratio at about 3-to-1, which is not what the IDF has continuously attempted to conclude. They'll say 2-to-1 or 1-to-1. Absurd. But then, okay, you also account for the fact that, yes, there's 10,000 people under the rubble. Then you also look at the fact that earlier last year, there was a report out of Plus 972 that the IDF admits that over 80%, I think the number was 83% of the Palestinians killed in Gaza are in fact civilians. So now you're at a situation where it's actually looking closer to a 1-to-5 ratio, between 1-to-5 or 1-to-6. That is far more comparable to genocides than it is to normal, quote unquote, wars in the region, right? That's far more comparable to something like the Rwandan genocide or in what was happening in Darfur in the early 2000s than it is to even the Syrian civil war or the war in Yemen. So everything about this vindicates the fact that Israel in no way operates as though they certainly don't operate with extra humanitarian concern, or they're the most moral army in the world, as many Israeli propagandists will have you believe, but that they actually operate far more closer to a genocidal state, which is exactly what the advocates of Palestinian human rights have been saying this entire time. So I need people to understand that this is further vindication of the truth, but it's also further vindication of another example of Israel overtly lying about something that we all suspected to be true. And shame on the pro-Israel propagandists like the TikTokers, the Cam Higbees, the older millennials, the Jeffrey Meads of the world for perpetuating this lie that these healthcare workers who are dealing with little to no infrastructure were just making up numbers. It's disgusting.